Hi, I'm Matt, and I talk about government and sometimes other things on this channel. Today, I'm going to be talking with you about the four phases of a successful resistance to an authoritarian regime. So, what I mean by that is that there are so many examples in history and currently of authoritarian regimes around the world, of them taking control, of them rising to power, of them existing, often for a short time, sometimes longer, and then sometimes being toppled or being addressed by their own government. And so, because we have all of these examples, we also have very useful guides of what does successful resistance look like and what are the phases. So, as we talk about this, I want to note there's more than one take on how to frame successful resistance against an authoritarian. I'm going to use a four-stage pathway to successful resistance, but I've seen very good summations that are in 3 stages, some of them that are in 5 stages. They tend to have the same elements, just they break them apart differently, and sometimes they overlap. So I would expect you'll hear everything that is relevant here during this conversation. But if you go look around online, you might find one that feels more comfortable to your specific journey through this resistance. Okay, so the first thing to talk about would be that everything exists in a life cycle, and that's a theme on this channel. We look at everything from a life cycle. There's a point before it, there's a point when it begins, a point when it runs, a point when it might have adjustments during its lifetime. There's points when it will be disposed of, and then there's a point after where we are looking back in history at something that happened. All of that should be considered when we look at any real concept that has any kind of risk or importance to it. And I would argue the resistance of an authoritarian regime is a very important issue in the life of anybody who experiences it. So let's dive in. The first phase would be recognition and awareness. So now we're going to see something that gets awkward because the phases of authoritarian resistance happen for each of us differently. So there are some groups who were really tuned in, really dialed in. They were recognizing very early on that this was a legitimate authoritarian regime rising to power fast with a kind of strategy that we had not typically seen in the United States before. There were people who were prepared for it, like all the attorneys general, that came together to be prepared with pre-written motions ready to file for almost every aspect of Project 2025, which turned out to be hugely important because almost all of those aspects lost in court. Which, thank you, attorneys general. You are such superstars. When we look backward in time, you probably did the biggest thing that anybody did to help us prevent Trump from ultimately becoming the authoritarian emperor of the United States. However, many people are still finding out that Trump is an authoritarian. It's not that they're idiots, it's that they're not plugged in. And for such a long time, the United States has told different audiences, you should not watch the news. The news will not be fun. Watch something else. And now that we're living in that time frame, we have this awkwardness that people are finding out later because their news wouldn't have told them this. Okay, so recognition and awareness begins, and then the second phase, which happens early for people that were very tuned in, is that they begin to organize and mobilize. The organization and mobilization effort will carry forward for the rest of the authoritarian regime. The rest of the resistance has an organization and mobilization effort. But the first one, the recognition piece, has already turned into organization and mobilization for the people that know. They've started revitalizing grassroots and civic rights organizations. They've started raising awareness in their communities and creating more and more media describing the fact that this kind of concern is maturing in front of us and we have to fight it. That will continue, like I said, for the rest of this journey, because even through the successful overthrow of an authoritarian regime, there's this lagging tail of the population that's still just finding out about it as it happens, as it has already happened. So understanding that some people are still organizing and mobilizing right up to the point that this is over, that phase has an unclear border on it. The third phase is the escalation and confrontation phase. Okay, so now looking at this idea that there's a direction of travel, people become aware, they sort of light up, Then they find a way to organize and become part of a mobilized effort. And now they're part of an escalation phase, meaning enough critical mass has gathered and they're pushing back against an authoritarian, and they're just constantly scooping up and gathering in more and more supporters, because that's this process, that's this conveyor belt into an authoritarian resistance effort. So with that approach happening now, we have this escalation rising. This is the place that some of us have found ourselves for a while, because we got up to the escalation phase right away and we've just been burning ourselves alive trying to keep it moving, trying to give everything we can to carry that mountain. It's important to remember that this is a fight that lasts a while. We want everybody to come along with us on this journey, but we have to show up every day. So the fact that the escalation phase takes forever is driven partially by the fact that people who've been really dialed in have been here the whole time. And other people are just arriving, just getting involved, just learning that there is a movement to join. And so I need everybody to recognize that one of the biggest contributions you make to a resistance is taking care of yourself enough that you can come back tomorrow. We have to keep showing up until it works. And that'll feel like it takes forever because we're already here. Meanwhile, the authoritarian will be ramping up a confrontation to that escalation. Let's talk about what this means. All right, when the escalation is already happening, an authoritarian has got to put that down, because the authoritarian's primary ability to hold on to power is coming from an intimidating cult of personality. He's got an audience that believes he is the only answer, that he's a strong man, and that there is a problem that only he can address. And he's got to keep that illusion alive. I'm saying he because they're pretty much always male, and pretty much always don't believe that, gender is more than a binary reference of sex. So with this authoritarian recognizing a conversation he needs to stop, he's going to start trying to send in different types of intimidating elements. He's also going to be trying to keep an election from deposing his power base in the legislature. So we're going to see what I refer to as wild swings, meaning once he starts realizing it's losing, and I'm saying he as if it's all Trump, but it's probably not Trump. We're probably talking about Russell Vought and Steve Miller mostly, but as that set of agencies under the executive branch are recognizing that this is failing, they're going to take a much harder swing. They're going to try to add a lot more power to it, make it a lot scarier. And that is going to be hard for us to watch, but it's a good indication that they're losing. Also, those kinds of swings don't really galvanize their base. Instead, it shows their base that they're going to become the uncomfortable, accidental trade-off in the moves that Trump makes. This has been his story the whole time. The people most hurt by Trump tend to be his own allies. And then the people that he considers powerless, who he'll try to use for examples. We just don't get as much information about them. They make a bigger sacrifice, but his agency is terrified that he's not going to be there to give them a pardon when this all fails. And it looks like it's failing, so they're going to engage in these wild swings. All right, so that kind of a flywheel is going to keep happening. He engages in a wild swing. We prove it doesn't work. The resistance grows. He tries to wild swing again. It's going to keep happening. That will continue until a reconciliation event occurs. And this gets us into the final phase, transition. Transition is back into a form that is more acceptable to the public. It may be back into a more democratic norm. It may be into a different kind of government. I don't know. I don't think going backward is the right answer because it wasn't working for too many people. And this kind of testing, this kind of shaking the cage that is happening to the United States right now is probably a smart time to take a moment to reconstruct what this building is going to look like when we're done. Okay, right now it's a cage. We need to turn it back into something that really empowers citizens, because there is a huge weakness in this model that Trump is engaging in. It leaves the whole country weak with the hope of short-term profit by the opportunists who are able to sell aspects of it, including its control. But that's not going to linger, and those people are all really old. So recognize an end is coming. The parties that are supporting it are keeping in mind that at some point it's time to jump ship. And that's where we can do our best work to make sure that that time arrives sooner than later. but we do it by recognizing that all four phases happen at the same time. People are at different stages of the pipeline of joining a resistance that will push back against a government that's trying to take away everything. So, how do we do it? Well, I want you to engage. Find a cause that you care about enough to give it at least an hour of your week every week. And then find that cause's local representation if it exists. If there isn't, then sure, join a national one. But check indivisible.org, mobilize.us, and sisterdistrict.com to find causes and candidates near you that you can add your strength to support. This is the easiest way to get involved. The second easiest way, which may sound easier, but it's harder because you got to keep at it, is getting involved with your community. Become a community organizer. Talk with everybody. Make sure that your community feels like an open place for people to talk with you, because more and more your community is going to find out that people that used to feel they were much safer don't feel that way anymore. And the people that have always felt unsafe have lessons for you to learn. One of my favorite things I heard recently on the Money with Katie podcast was Anna Gifty discussing the way that Black women are essentially the canary in the coal mine when it comes to fixing any kind of economic problem. Because as one of the most discriminated against and disrespected populations in the United States, they tend to have overlap with the problems of almost any other group, which means that when we solve problems for them, we solve problems for everybody. It's a fascinating review to take on this, but as somebody who cares about their community, it makes a lot of sense. If we wanted to pick one group to support because it would help everybody, it's Black women. And if you want to recognize also what contribution looks like when you're not paying attention, it's the fact that there is a degree of exhaustion for Black women, not just having the environment around them that takes everything from them in a very, very painful and consistent and exhausting squeeze. But it's also the fact that they do get tired of being everybody else's answer, of being somebody that adds to everybody else getting their problem solved and not being treated as the avenue that gets you there. So let's take a moment. Let's take a point to recognize in our communities, there are people who know answers that we don't necessarily all know. Those people may be the ones who had the problem the longest. Find a way to connect and to support your community members, especially the ones who have the information that your whole community needs. Okay, more on that in the future, but for now, there's 4 phases to keep in mind on a transition between an authoritarian government and something different. And that was the recognition, organization, escalation, and finally transition phase. We are in the escalation phase now, but not everybody is. So let's bring them all along. Talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, engage safely, keep your wits about you, and let's do this together. We're walking each other home.